Once the money was wired into my bank account, within 2 hours, I received a text message from unknown individuals purporting to be my bank. They would have stolen a substantial amount of money from the sale of our house.
That is only one instance of many increasingly sophisticated threats emerging in a post-pandemic world. But the man being targeted by would-be thieves isn't some clueless fool. He's actually a security professional with decades of experience in law enforcement and personal protection.
Most people don't understand that there is a threat. They hear it, but they don't know what the threat is.
Victor Medina is president and CEO of Delta Strategic Solutions, a company that focuses on security, investigations, and intelligence. He argues being educated about risks is essential nowadays, regardless if you're a small business or major corporation.
Ask the difficult question: what are you doing for me? What does it cost? How are you doing it?
So where are you supposed to get the right information when it comes to security? How do you prepare for threats you may not even be able to see? And why is it important to treat security like a fire escape plan? Hello there, I'm Tristan Field-Jones. Welcome to the inaugural edition of SitRep. We're now joined by Victor Medina. And Victor, introduce yourself. Tell us a little more about you and how you got involved in the world of security.
Sure. Well, Tristan, first I want to say it is a true pleasure to be on with you. Greatly appreciated. Looking forward to sharing with you and your audience. So I, back at the age of actually 17, I went into the Army. And from an early age, I kind of knew I wanted to be in security. I was one of those kids in junior high school and high school who wore the badge and did security in the hallways in between classes. So I went into the Army Reserves at the age of 17. And at the age of 20, I became a member of the New York City Transit Police Department, which eventually was merged into the NYPD. I did 20 years in the NYPD in various units, to include K9, the Emergency Service Unit, investigative units. So I did about 11 out of my 20 years in special operations. While I was in the police department, I actually met my partner on a presidential detail. I didn't know him at the time, but we met, and he was the director of presidential advance operations for the White House. And we were working together on a presidential assignment, and we became friends. And to this day, now we're best friends. And in 2002, we started our company, Delta Strategic Solutions. Delta Strategic Solutions provides executive protection, cyber services, investigations domestically, as well as internationally. We're based in New York, have an office in Mexico, where we provide these services to auto manufacturers, among others, throughout Latin America.
Now, you talked a little bit about your career in the NYPD, and I'm a little curious to maybe dive a little deeper into that in terms of how you dealt with security risks back then, because I think that'll be a good basis for our conversation when we look at how safety and security has evolved over decades, really. So you mentioned that you were involved in developing protection protocols, and you worked with emergency services and internal investigations. So when you were coming up with those security plans, what were the biggest risks you identified at that time?
So it's a great question. You know, our world has changed today. We've migrated, right? We've grown. Back in those days, you didn't have the proliferation of social media. So I retired from the NYPD in 2006. So back in that time, when we were providing protection or developing security protocols for dignitaries, you didn't have the proliferation of social media. So the threats were not as you always had threats and you had intelligence, but today you're seeing a global network as compared to what we saw previously in the 1990s and 2000s when I was in the police department. The police department has done a wonderful, at least I can speak for the NYPD, has done a wonderful job of now they actually have police officers stationed throughout the world to gather intelligence for the police department because New York City in itself is a target. So that information would come back from around the world, and we would use that to provide protection and to establish security matrices and protocols for those that we're protecting.
Now, when we look at those risks that you mentioned, how did that change over time? And I'm thinking, especially since you were, I mean, on the ground during 9/11, as an example, that must have completely changed the playbook, or at least had a huge impact on your operations.
And it did. I think in law enforcement in general, 9/11 was a turning point for those that were in law enforcement, not only those that were on the ground, but in the command staff as well, to think about risk, to think about the threats that exist or existed during that time. So I think it was a turning point to understand that it was a global threat as compared to a local threat. So still today in law enforcement and in policing, you have obviously your street crime that is addressed. But now police departments and law enforcement professionals in general not only have to think about the local threats that exist and local crime, but also have to think about the global aspect of security and crime as well. Case in point may be uh, a cell, a terrorist cell that might be operating or developing in an area that otherwise would not be developing. So New York City, Los Angeles, Miami, these are very big cities that you would think they have these threats. But nowadays you'll see where these cells and otherwise will develop in areas that are not normally known to the public. So this has developed a better working relationship with federal partners, where local law enforcement, state partners, and federal partners share information as compared to how it was before 9/11, where there wasn't that much sharing of information, and not for any other reason other than, again, 9/11 was that turning point.
Obviously, a lot has changed, let alone since 9/11, let alone since the 90s, but in the last 2 years when it comes to security risks. And I think that plays into your point in terms of a different approach to crime. So when you look at the landscape out there, when we do our best to try and factor in all the upheaval we've seen from the pandemic, what do you see as the biggest security threats nowadays, especially for, like you mentioned, the retailers, the mom and pop shop at the corner of the street, that sort of thing? What do you see as those biggest threats?
Today, cyber is a very real threat. We don't see it. Because it's not in front of us, but there are small businesses, large corporations, medium businesses that are losing hundreds of millions of dollars in the aggregate, uh, trillions of dollars a year through hacking, through uh, remote kidnapping, all these types of issues that are recurring, extortion, the taking over of small business systems. So it used to be back in the day that hackers were only concerned about the big corporations. But unfortunately, today that is not the case. The threat is very real for small businesses as it is for large corporations. And I can give you a few examples. A matter of fact, I'll give you a personal example, which just occurred to me 6 months ago. Uh, as you may know, I moved out of New York. We sold our home and we now live in Florida. Uh, the day that we closed on our house, on the sale of our house, once the money was wired into my bank account, within 2 hours, I received a text message from an unknown uh, individual or individuals purporting to be my bank. Now, fortunately, I'm well versed on these type of incidences, and I immediately reported it. And I actually spoke to the attorneys in the title company because what had happened was someone was hacked. So here's a perfect example. On the closing, at least I understand in New York, you have about 7 or 8 parties at the very minimum that are involved in a closing. You have your three bank attorneys, your two real estate agents, you have your title company, and you have the realtors, and obviously you have your buyer and your seller. So this is a network. One of those individuals was very possibly hacked, unbeknownst to the individual. So what happens? Now the hackers, you have bullpens in other countries who all their job is to get information on us, to see what's going on, to hack uh, corporations and small businesses. So someone very far away knew that I closed, had my information, had my cell phone, and sent me a text message. If I would have clicked on that message and followed through on their instructions, we would have lost the money from the sale of our home. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't know this or they don't see this because it's not a threat that appears right in front of us. But I could see that a very major threat that exists in our society today is exactly that. Uh, so the education process to educate small businesses, individuals of this threat is paramount.
Well, and that's a really good point, Victor, because one of the aspects, especially when it comes to the hacking that you mentioned in your own personal example, those texts are increasingly, for lack of a better term, clever. I think back in the day when the spam was just starting out, and how easy was it for you to ignore an email that said a Nigerian prince sent you this, right? We all remember those scams where it was pretty easy to ignore that. But using your example, and now fortunately you have the training for that, but it's easy to see how people who maybe didn't think about it twice, or maybe just aren't fully aware of it, could get sucked into something like that. And that's really dangerous because what if, again, like for you, this was a personal example, but what if they have the cell phone of a vice president of a major corporation? Or if they have the cell phone for someone who works in a high level security role? I mean, really, this isn't something that necessarily targets a specific demographic, if you will. It sounds to me like this is a risk that could really affect anyone, regardless if you're Joe Blow on the street or working for the president of the U.S.
Sure, Tristan, and that's an awesome example. Today, so one of the main services that we provide is executive protection. And it alludes back to your uh, first question was the landscape of providing protection. So back then, we provided that physical. We ensured that the physical well-being of the individual was taken care of. Today, executive protection for individuals such as you indicated, whether it be the vice president or president of a major corporation, an important dignitary, or the president of the United States, whoever that might be, encompasses so much more than just the physical aspect of the individual, but it incorporates as well the well-being of their family, their finances, their social standing. Those are critical points. So today we provide a holistic type of protection for individuals, which includes not only their well-being, but monitoring social media, uh, ensuring that cyber protections are in place, the education of for those that we protect of situations just as we indicated that occurred to me. So it has evolved not just to the well-being of the physical threat that might exist, but the financial threat as well.
And when you talk about physical security, is that maybe a little bit of an outdated concept? Because you mentioned there a bunch of things that aren't necessarily physical, but have to be accounted for when you're protecting anyone, really. So, is physical security just security nowadays because there are so many more factors and because we are so much more interconnected?
Well, I wouldn't say that the physical aspect is outdated because there are still viable threats that an individual may have. Again, I think we see in corporations today that take a political stance and that might be contrary to another group's understanding or feelings. And and threats arise, whether it's for that CEO, whether it's for one of their high corporate individuals. And so now what happens is it's not just that individual that has the threat, but it may be the actual corporation itself. So the physical protection is still in a very important piece, but also as well is that cyber piece. So depending on the size of the corporation, depending on who they are, obviously measures have to be taken. But I think what has happened is it's actually made it a more dynamic uh, industry in providing that security for these individuals, whether they be individuals, whether they be corporations. So it's not just, as we would say, that bodyguard per se. It has professionalized. The industry has professionalized to segments that have the physical and to have the virtual for the cyber for the client.
So, having all that in mind, Victor, what would you say are the biggest security threats nowadays? You work with a lot of important people. You hear a lot from your clients, and I'm sure from your fellow security professionals around the world. What nowadays, and especially as we transition into this post-pandemic world, what do you hear as the biggest concerns regarding security?
So speaking about families, I think you look at common crimes. And then when you speak about corporations, uh, what are the threats that they see? I think they see threats that are physical, as well as we saw the Louis Vuitton stores that were uh, uh, where these gangs go in and they just take what they want. But then also you have the virtualist or the cyber threat that exists today. So here's a situation I think we saw there was a situation in New York in one of the stores where a gang went in, they stole $48,300 worth of bags in downtown Manhattan. A cyber threat can steal 10 times that. If a cyber threat that is carried out can cost the company 10 times that, maybe even more. All right. Example, again, the example that I gave, they would have stolen a substantial amount of money from the sale of our house as compared to just going into a store and stealing. So the cyber threats today are extremely dangerous to individuals, families. I think the education process there is critical to our small businesses, our mom and pops, as we say, which is the backbone of our economy, as well, obviously, to big businesses. Big businesses, they have the resources, the financial resources to go out and to put into protecting their systems. And still, we've seen today many of them, all right, have been hacked, have been compromised, and that's what we only hear about a few of them, all right. But we don't hear about the proliferation of hacks into our medium business and small businesses because it's not recorded, whether through embarrassment or if a small business loses 30, $40,000, that's a substantial amount of money to a small business. So the threat, unfortunately, runs the gamut.
So, when we look at all of these factors that you've mentioned here, I think it's pretty clear we need to, as if you're a corporate security professional or even just, again, the business on the corner of the street, it comes across, at least to me, that you really need to have a plan in place, but this plan can't be just a piece of paper anymore. It needs to evolve. It needs to adapt because we live in an era where the situation changes so quickly and information is available so quickly. So, Victor, how I'm sure a lot of people and a lot of professionals have started doing this already, but if you're listening to this and you haven't, or you maybe don't have the resources, what would be some of your advice you could provide in terms of having a security plan that's easily adaptable and can suit a world that is changing ever so rapidly?
That's a wonderful question. So I guess you remember back in the day when the the government, or there were announcements that would say, "Hey, listen, have a plan in case there's a fire in your house." Remember that? what do we do? Uh, we meet outside. We use this window. There was a plan, and I think that's a wonderful point. Is having a plan, and, and we see that most businesses and most people, they're just trying to make a living. Understanding, hey, we want to raise our children, we want to help them go to school, we want to invest for retirement. So it's critical to have a plan. So it's to say that one of the things that we've seen here at Delta is we've seen that there is a need for education and also to provide these type of cyber services for small businesses. Again, as we said, large companies have the money to invest to protect their systems, but small businesses, medium businesses, it's not a line item. So being a security company, we're also business people, and we understand that there's a need to protect what we've worked so hard for. So we're actually in the process at the final stages of developing a program for small businesses where we can help them to start protecting their cyber they're in networks, in their homes, in their businesses. Give them someone that can support them, and it doesn't have to be Delta per se, but find a company, find someone that can help to protect your services and educate. I think the critical component here is the education. To go back to my first statement, we were educating back in the day with fires. We were educating the communities. We wanted to make sure everyone had smoke alarms, right? So I don't recall the statistic, but I read this about a year ago how the uh, casualties from house fires went down considerably due to the education of the community about smoke alarms. And this is what we need to do with regard to the cyber threats that exist in our communities today. And the thing is, these threats are not local, they're actually global in nature. So the education is critical. And then having someone that can assist the small businesses, families that can protect their networks at a very reasonable price. And that's something that we're actually rolling out over the next month and a half. That is Delta as a corporation.
So really, the takeaway here, Victor, is a modern day security plan is your fire escape plan.
Excellent point. That's exactly what it is. It's the continual education, understanding. So most people don't understand that there is a threat. They hear it, but they don't know what the threat is. So the education process to educate uh, our population about the cyber threat that exists today, just as we speak about crime, street crime, just as we speak about fraud, the cyber threat is a very real threat. And the education process can save lives and it can save the financial nest eggs of our community.
In any industry, and maybe people listening to this podcast, they may hear this and say, you know what, Victor, that's all great advice, but our plan worked during the pandemic. We got out relatively unscathed. We don't see much of a need to change the way we do things. What would be your response to that? Because again, in every industry, you have those people who are old school, for lack of a better term, right? How would you address if someone came up to you and said that? How would you address that?
Wow, that's really great. And I think we see that in every segment of society, right? People who they say returning to normal, right? Tristan, they talk about returning to normal. And the reality is there is a possibly a new normal. Uh, where now we've never lived through a pandemic, or at least our generation has not, and now we see the new normal. And I think from a leadership perspective, there has to be those that take the leadership role to educate our communities and understand that there has to be growth within our communities and understanding within our communities, just as we did, again, to speak about the education of household fires. We have to be targeted with the education and show the results of what can happen when we educate the community. And again, not to speak about my personal situation, but I like to use it because it's real. It happened to me. we're not speaking about, well, my friend's brother's husband, so to speak, but it's something that happened to me. And I think your viewers will say, wow, I know someone that happened to, or wow, I saw this coming, and I got a text message just as the one that Victor got. So the education process is critical, and it's changing our mindset. And that goes back to leadership, right? Uh, I love what John Maxwell says, everything rises and falls with leadership. So those in our community, our leaders in government, our leaders in business, uh, have to take a step forward to educate and develop programs. And that's what we've done. We see that there's a need for education. We see that there's a need for to protect.
Where do we fall short when it comes to education? Is it a matter of a lack of resources? Is it a matter of maybe not understanding social media too well? I mean, where do we fall short when it comes to that?
Well, so I think it's all those and some. I think not understanding the power of social media is we're seeing it more and more. And again, we have kids today, obviously, who are born into it and understand it more readily than someone such as myself, who was born in the 60s, right? So we've had to learn. Uh, but I think not understand the power of social media, how they take those hackers, as we said, who sit in the bullpen, take your information and they scan. So I'll get, again, a personal example. On Sunday morning, I have protections in place for our accounts and my social security number, and I get a notification that my social security number was observed in the dark web. We need to, with regard to the education piece, we're not seeing these things because we're not understanding the impact of social media. Though I think we're starting to see it more now, there are those, as you indicated, that maybe are not haven't grown yet into the understanding of the social media piece. Uh, the training, as well as those, as you said, maybe got a little older school, don't understand it, have to have people that can help them, trusted people. And that's another thing as well. Not just letting anyone in. So doing background checks. We just a perfect example. Again, we have a client right now that hired an individual to run their own supermarkets in New York City. And they had to end up firing the individual. And they came to us and they said, we need a background check on this individual. Well, that individual ended up having 20 arrests. 7 of them were for armed robbery. Case in point, uh, those that you let into your organizations, those that you let into your home, uh, doing background checks on individuals beforehand so that you understand who you're hiring, so that you understand who you're letting into your network, so to speak. It is very, very important. And again, that's one of the programs that we have here. We provide background checks for corporations, and we do checks for nannies. We have clients who hire nannies, and obviously, when you're going to leave your child with an individual who's a nanny, you want to know everything about them. So very important to educate the community about who they let into their inner circle.
Now, when we keep all that in mind, education is obviously a two-way street, right? There's only so much that people like you can do to get the message out. But for people listening to this and watching this, what can they do to get themselves better informed? Because honestly, even just doing a quick Google search costs nothing.
Great point. What are we trying to do? Are we trying to uh, protect our networks as a small business? You're so right. You can do a Google search and you can look at the different companies and vet them out. Vet out the companies. Ask the difficult questions. What are you doing for me? What does it cost? How are you doing it? Look at reviews, uh, interview them. I always say, let the client interview those that they want to bring on into their network. So that is a critical piece. Uh, as when you Google, there's a proliferation of companies that will come up. Uh, and so you will have a good uh, uh, arena to be able to match something or that would fit, whether it's a budget or whether it's, hey, I'm looking to protect a certain aspect of my network. How can I do that? And so there are people today, and we make ourselves available as well. We're more than welcome. We want to educate the community. If we can be of service, great. There's various ways to be of service. Obviously, if we can provide the service for them at a low cost, we're welcome to do that. But as well, if we can give guidance to individuals, we want to help the community. It's not always about the financial gain, but it's really about helping people and educating them. And it does cost money to put into education. And sometimes corporations may not see the return on the education. But I think if we target segments of corporate, if business owners target segments of the community to educate, we'll see the return on investment as a country and as a community.
And I guess, Victor, as we wrap up here, I think that's a really good point to kind of end this on, because we have to consider the bottom line, especially when it comes to, well, really when it comes to any company or business, frankly, right? It doesn't matter if you have, billions of dollars at your disposal or just, a few thousand. These, from what you're saying here, these security plans and this research can be can potentially save you a lot more down the line. So is that kind of the pitch that needs to be made to businesses big and small when it comes to hiring professional security help or anything along those lines?
Tristan, and that is a wonderful point. And I'll give you a great example of that. Uh, so we provide executive protection for a very large auto manufacturer in Mexico, based out of Japan. So we've been providing services for this particular client for about 13 years now. About 3 years into the contract, they came to us and says, I think we're going to downsize our contract with you because we don't see anything that's happening. And it was a valuable lesson to our organization. And I said, well, the reason you don't see anything happening is because of all the work that we do to ensure that you don't see anything happen. But it was a critical point. So what we started doing is educating the client to see what was happening around him, around their people, to show them what we were keeping them away from. And then they said, wow, we realize what you do. And it's a critical piece, right? Showing you what it is that we do for our clients. And gone are the days are, don't worry, I have you, I'll take care of everything. No, we have to continue to educate our clients. So going back to your question, that is the key. Showing them what we're saving the client from, whether it's that virtual threat, whether it's that physical threat, right? We're a very much data-driven, analytics-driven society today as compared to where we were 20 years ago. So showing the client what it is that we're doing for them validates the work that we are doing for them.
In my previous job as a journalist, we had a saying where it was, "We don't report on planes landing safely."
That's a great point.
Kind of
Yeah.
along those lines, where it's like, yeah, the reason why bad stuff isn't happening is because we're preventing it from happening. Or again, from my perspective, the reason you hear about bad news is because it's generally the exception to the rule, right? So I think that's a phenomenal point there, Victor. This has been absolutely a fabulous discussion. I want to give you an opportunity, if people want to find out more about you and Delta Strategic Solutions, where can they go? Where can they start reading some stuff and maybe get in touch?
Sure. Well, and we thank you. We're grateful for the opportunity to be of service. Our website is deltastrategicsolutions.com, all spelled out. Uh, can also call our office at 516-280-5324, or feel free to email me directly at for my first name, Victor, the Medina, Medina, at D as in David, S as in Sam, S as in Sam, O as in Oscar, P as in Peter, S as in Sam.com.
Okay, and we'll have all this information in the podcast description as well. Victor, thanks so much for your insight. Really appreciate it.
Listen, thank you so much. You honor me with this opportunity.
As Victor Medina, he's president and CEO of Delta Strategic Solutions, joining us on SitRep. I'm Tristan Field-Jones. Thank you for listening to this week's edition of the podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email me, sitrep@samdesk.io, or follow us on Twitter @samdeskofficial. Until next time, stay safe out there.